that we're growing and we're going someplace, and that we've taken a direction that is going to lead us to some place in life. But in fact, at the end of the journey, and I've been lucky enough to find the end of the journey for myself, there is no place that you've ever gone. The journey ends in infinity, and at the same time, infinity incorporates all silence and all activity. And so, and as you establish that awareness, you realize that you have never left the beginning, you never got started, and you're always at the beginning of the journey, and the way you know that is because you've never left. So we call it the pathless path.
That's a pretty remarkable concept. Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you, Sandy.
I'm curious about how you started on your pathless path as a child.
Well, thank you, Sandy. It's kind of interesting. I'm sure we all start on our own path in our own way. But I'll share with you some of the decisions that I made in my path. One of the earliest decisions that I can ever remember was to follow sacred teachings. Sacred teachings for each individual will be completely unique. Mine were the teachings of Christ, the Dalai Lama, Buddha, and I'm sure they're familiar to an awful lot of people. But I chose to live by some of those principles to the best of my ability and to learn what the knowledge was contained in those teachings and apply it in my daily life. I gave myself permission to learn and grow. It isn't easy when you start within a doctrine to expand beyond the doctrine. And so starting in a very Christian-oriented capacity, I had to at one time in my life say, I want to find out what the knowledge is if I experiment beyond the doctrine. Well, of course, it's a very frightening place, Sandy, because to go beyond the doctrine means that you have to actually, in some way, sacrifice your key to immortality. Because the doctrine says that if you experiment and you lose your soul, you don't reach immortality according to that doctrine. So you have to be interested enough in yourself to give yourself the permission to grow, and secure enough to know that you can trust God's love, and it will be there if you don't do things that harm yourself or harm somebody else. So those were the decisions I had to make along my path. Then I had to decide somewhere along the line to live by my personal truths, because when you go outside the doctrine, you understand truths that weren't contained within the doctrine. And you understand that those truths are absolutely real because you've lived the personal experience that validates that truth for you. And in that process, if you weren't to live by that truth, then you would actually be hypocritic not to a doctrine, but to your own soul. And so to live by your own truth becomes a really valuable point in a decision transition. At least it was for me in my path, Sandy.
Those traditional religious beliefs, and I'd like to hear more about what kinds of things you did as a child and as a young adult growing up.
I'd be glad to share them with you, Sandy. Services, so that I could make comparisons between the new experience of spirituality that the religion that I was experimenting with was presenting, and the old knowledge that was coming from the paradigm and the religious doctrine that I had been brought up in. And very often these were very challenging. And I also found that some of the new experiences I didn't like, and I had to use a value system. I had to develop a value system that allowed me to guide myself without direction. And so some of those were, do you want to really have a reaction for every action, or do you just forgive and forget? And I had to make those decisions. So personally, I chose that as long as I were to have an experience that didn't offend or hurt people directly, or myself, that I would give myself the freedom to enjoy that kind of spirituality, even though it was beyond what was being put forth as the limit of the doctrines that I was experiencing. So I had a very open mind, and I experienced with most of the contemporary religions, and my fascination was in the Far East, in the Tibetan paths, in the Hindu paths, and even as a small child, as I would watch people firewalk on television, I always felt that there was a capacity of human know-how that wasn't being incorporated in our Western culture. And so that gave me the drive. It was sort of like the glimmer of hope at the end of the tunnel, that sometime during my life, I may have the experience and the knowledge that went with the actual physical process. So I felt intuitively that the ability to walk on fire, for instance, held within it a spiritual value that was much closer to what I wanted to understand and experience as a divine nature than just going to a ceremony with books that had words written in them that really didn't have a personal value for me. So I allowed myself that opportunity. Now, being raised in Manhattan didn't give me a real advantage, and I wasn't able to get to Tibet, and I'm still not able to do that. But I was able to research through literature and through personal experience by talking to people that had traveled. And so I collected around myself books of interest and acquaintances that would stimulate those interesting thoughts so that I could experiment and weigh them within myself and find out how they felt. Later on, they became practical experiences that I actually went out and sought and did. And so I actually gained from those experiences a direct knowledge. For instance, about 7 years ago, I actually built my own fire. I had read a book about fire walking written by Michael Skye called Dancing with Fire, and there were very little hints on how it was done. There was some scientific validation that fire walking was possible, and the recommendation in the book was that if you got 78 pieces of hardwood, give or take a few, and you burnt them down to a very bright red coal, that you could rake that into a path about 4 feet wide and about 12 feet long, and then, knowing that you had that ability, just step onto it. And I have a very funny aspect to that story, Sandy. When I did this for myself, I had no teacher, and I had invited about 100 people because I'm a bit of a showman, and I wanted to have a nice party around the first time I firewalked. But fortunately, the universe knew much better, and in fact, only about 6 very close friends showed up. Even my family decided to go inside because they didn't want to see Dad laying fried on to a pile of coals. And so I built the fire, I did some drumming, and then during the evening, even my close friends came up and said, "How many times have you done this?" And when I informed them that this was my first opportunity, the nurses said, "Oh my God, we don't even know how we're going to deal with this. We should have ambulances here, and we thought you were a professional." And I said, "No, I just have the conviction." And so one at a time, those people that were very close to me came up and shared their fear with me. And I soon became conscious that if I had had 100 people there, that it wasn't not only my fear that I would have to overcome, I would have to come all of their fears too. And so I became very happy that the universe only gave me a very small audience. So after the fire had burned a while, and I did my drumming and I asked for safe passage, I literally stepped onto the fire with my left foot. And to my utter amazement, I found myself on the other side of the path of flames, having had no experiential knowledge of what just took place. So I ran over to my friend who had decided that he would give me a gift of a video, and I said, "Let me see what we filmed, because I feel like I was been cheated out of the experience." And he apologized. He said, "I was so amazed that you actually did that, because they had to stand about 25 feet away from the fire. It was so hot they were afraid the camera equipment would be affected. Nobody really thought I would do it." He said, "I forgot to turn on the camera."
Oh.
And so I was so disappointed, and I had no personal memory of the experience. And I said, "I know what I'll do. I'll run around and do it again real quick, and then we can take videos and we can take photographs, and I'll have some experience." So I got to the beginning of the fire path, and I thought, I wonder if it's really hot, and I stepped on. So we have one of America's funniest home videos that my children love to watch, which is Dad jumping and screaming across this hotbed of fire, and I really scorched the bottom of my feet. And I learned a wonderful lesson at that moment, Sandy. I was so happy that I had the duality of the experience, because the first time I had asked for safe passage, and I really received that. And the second time, I was given the value of my intent. I intended to know if the fire was hot, and I found out it was scorching hot. And so I learned something much greater than if I had just had safe passage. I learned that my thoughts were creating my reality, and it was indelibly burned into the soles of my feet. Okay? And so that was a fabulous lesson. I went on to do other things. I decided to experiment with native cultures. I couldn't get to Tibet to study with the monks, and I couldn't get to India to study with some of the rishis, but I could learn from the Native American storytellers, from the Native American shamans. And so I had the desire to do that. What I did, I took advantage of the harmonic convergence. The harmonic convergence was a period of time that the Mayans had given us that said if we had an attention established during a certain period of time, that our life would unfold to fulfill the intent that we had made for ourselves. I had been suffering with some major illnesses, with pleurisy, with pneumonia. I also had strep throat rather frequently. I was extremely overweight, and I had very severe allergies during periods of the year. So I had a great drive to grow, and I felt that by not opening myself up to spirituality, that I was actually suppressing the energy flow within my being. I had become a very successful financial businessman, and so I had no need for anything else in the physical world, but I had a great desire to develop my spirituality. And so I decided to do something, and I went to the harmonic convergence ceremonies that were held here in Rochester, New York, and I just intended to enliven my spiritual qualities. Through that, I came into some wonderful experiences, and I started to unfold the knowledge of how intent was giving me what I needed to become realized as a spiritual being. And so that evening in the harmonic convergence, I made contact with a person that helped me get a tympanum drum. I asked my inner knowing what I should do as my first spiritual commitment, and I was told to go down to the spirits of the waterfall at the lower falls of the Genesee, and the date I was to do this was December 22nd, and to just make noise and enjoy myself. Because as human beings, we are one of the few animals in the entire universe that can consciously create joy and express that as a vibration. And I intuitively knew that the spirits of that place had been ignored for generations because our culture didn't understand the value of giving spiritual delight. And so I felt a nice opportunity to take that as my first spiritual goal. And so I offered this gentleman some information in exchange for where I could get a drum made. And then the drum was sent to me in the appropriate time. And I went into my yard and I played the drum just to hear what it sounded like. I was sort of a shy person, and I'd never played something that noisy in public. And I wanted to sort of get a good handle on it before I did it to the waterfall, or for the waterfall spirits. And then when I played the drum, the amazing part was that I started to hear the neighbor children singing war whoops with me. And it sounded very much like, "Woo!" And I thought, boy, I know that they live next to an eccentric, but now they're playing along with the eccentric. And so I played the drum for a while, and then I stopped and I spoke out loud and I said, "It's okay if you don't want to tease me anymore. I'm very happy to be here by myself." And what happened was I realized the children were never outside playing and teasing me, that it was actually the voice of the drum that was singing with me. Well, the intellect, Sandy, was telling me that that was impossible, that a drum couldn't have a voice. And yet I distinctly heard the sounds of voices singing along with my drumming. I was very excited to go out later that night and to pray for a cousin of mine who had been in a car accident. And she was a beautiful young woman who was going to be a pre-law student, but she was in a coma. And I wanted to use the highest spiritual value I could have to give her whatever prayer value there was available. And in that capacity, I prayed for something to come through that I could help her with. I heard a noise behind me, Sandy, and as that noise sounded, I became filled with terror. And when I looked to see what it was, there was a column of fog in the air that fell to the earth, and standing in its place was a possum. And it filled me with such terror that I didn't even know how to run away. And I sat there, and I had shorts on, and I thought, this must be a possum that has rabies, and the only place it will bite me is in the groin, and I'll have a horrible experience. And so I was literally terrified, too terrified to move. The possum came over, and it put its head on my left foot. And I had prayed and wanted a spiritual experience like this all my life, but I was so terrified that I looked at the animal and I said, "Possum, please forgive me, but I can't stand the fear. Will you please go away?" It did. It turned and it went straight away from me, and it left me sitting there. I had knowledge unfold within myself, Sandy. I knew that spiritually I had played possum in my life, that I had been asleep in the material in the physical and awaken the material, and now that part of my spirituality was waking up. I also knew that even though this person was in a coma, they were alive, and so the animal, the knowledge of the sleeping quality of that animal, its power, was revealed to me. I had so many wonderful experiences after that. I was invited that weekend to partake in a sweat lodge, or a sacred stone people's lodge. I knew nothing about Native Americans, but I knew that that connection had been made. In that lodge, I learned about heart centers and chakras. I sat next to an old Indian that I had judged and thought perhaps wasn't really too with it. Years later, that Indian was revealed to me. He was Grandfather Chips, and they made a movie called Dancing with Wolves about his medicine ways. And he was the Lakota medicine man that held that pipe. And so I didn't know where the path was leading, but I followed the path of my heart, and it eventually took me beyond time and space, Sandy. It took me to a place of infinity. I was in a shamanic journey one evening, and my world stopped. I became aware that my breathing had ceased some time earlier, minutes before, and I asked, where am I? And it was revealed to me that you are being. And I thought to myself, what is being? And it was revealed to me there's a state of knowing that simultaneously occurs with the experience, so without any question you absolutely know that you are being told the truth. And I asked, what is being? And I knew that everything that ever was or could be is what being is. And then I said, well, is nothing being? And I knew that at that moment, things that weren't will never be. So being is all that is, but nothing that isn't will ever be. Now that sounds a little different than we're used to communicating, because in that state of knowing, there is no I am. There is just being. So to describe it with a language that was made to be egocentric or self-descriptive really doesn't incorporate the value of the knowledge at that level. I went on to say, if I am all things, then what is emptiness? And I knew instantaneously that emptiness was the boundary of experience that defined being, and that nothing that couldn't be conceived would never be. I asked then, what is transcendence? And I instantly knew that the experience of being immortal, omnipresent, and unbounded was the nature of transcendence, and that the experience could never be comprehended, because what we comprehend things with is our intellect, and the intellect is an aspect of being. And because it's only an aspect of being, it can never comprehend the full value of being. But Sandy, that doesn't mean that we can't experience the full value of being. We can literally experience the full value of being by becoming being. And the intellect is suspended, but the appreciation is so filling that you convulse with love, because when you are being, you are only yourself for all eternity. I asked, what is bliss? And bliss is the experience of being in full consciousness. So we can be for eternity, but we're in bliss when we're conscious of being. And so to experience being while we're still alive and while we're still fully conscious, we live in bliss. I asked then, how big am I, Sandy? And I understood that I was eternal, that there was no end to my vastness. I am without beginning, without end. I am in perfect balance. I am every possibility. Nothing can destroy me. I am everything. There is nothing that I am not. For me, all existence arises. Being all that is, the mind is within me, and therefore comprehend all that I am. Knowing this, all fear that I ever had and will ever had vanished forever, because now I have nothing to be afraid of, because the world is literally who I am. The universe is literally who I am. And so why would you ever be afraid of being yourself? So it freed me from the bonds of fear. I asked then, what is love? And I understood that love was the awareness of who you are when you are the self, the eternal being. To know everything is yourself is to know unbounded love. Knowing this, I was filled with wave after wave of bliss that actually had me convulsing with experiences of love. Love that the physical body was never designed to enjoy. But I believe that we can refine the nervous system to a level that you can live with that love fully awake and fully conscious and still maintain bliss and the knowledge of immortality, all simultaneously. So we don't have to become fragmented. We can become literally united in the physical body, fully awake. I opened up my eyes, Sandy, and at that moment, I literally saw only myself. I was standing with hundreds of people. I knew all of their pasts and all of their futures, and I knew that they lived only so that I could experience my self-awareness. It was such a wonderful thing. All of their senses were my senses. All of their experiences were my experiences. That's what I understand to be Brahman consciousness, when you have literally attained knowledge of all that is simultaneously in one lifetime. I chose not to stay there because I had to offer a gift of appreciation to one human being. And I came back in the human body to help all of my extended body in the universe become aware that it is living in joy for all eternity. And in doing that, I will have said thank you to the person that helped me maintain that awareness and reach the end of my path in where I learned that my path never started, never went anyplace, and wound up right where I began, in infinity. Thank you very much for getting me the opportunity to share that with you, Sandy.
Thank you. The next question I have for Stan is, now that you have integrated, hopefully, all of this experience, how are you going to apply it in the rest of your life?
Sandy, the integration was really, really quite intense. To come back and to be able to not talk to anybody at all. There's nobody I've met, with the exception of one individual, in the last 10 months that really understands how to appreciate life with an unbounded awareness. But I know what my job is. My job is to eliminate the illusion that disease is really necessary. Disease is literally only a mistake of the intellect. So in all capacities, I'm using my energies to do healings in different ways. I've formed a corporation that has the structure of an atom, so that there is no linear path of authority that people share, and they can grow and become anything that they want to become. That organization's name is HAPPY, Healthy Alternatives, Programs of Personal Empowerment. I've written books on how to maintain health through diet and holistic means that is so integrated, and the choice that I made to share wellness is through Maharishi Ayurveda. It's the only medical system that I know of that actually takes you to the experience of immortality. It was designed by people that had a culture that knew immortality personally, and they put together a medical system that would allow all people in their culture to experience immortality. In addition to that, Sandy, I've been accepting unusual things and doing things that I would have never thought possible. I, for instance, decided to run on the Natural Law Party as a candidate for senator in New York State. I really feel that people with integrity and knowledge have to become involved in politics so that we stop trying to solve our problems in the physical realm and use our connection to infinity to desire the problem. Because one of the great joys, Sandy, that I hadn't had a chance to share with you is that once we become immortal, once we contact our unbounded nature, the simplest desire actually manifests the universe right in front of us. And so as people contact that field, they won't have to worry about fighting with crime. Crime won't be able to be supported because the laws of nature will only support peace. And that's why I'm changing the direction of my life so drastically. I'm finding out, though, Sandy, that the people that I speak with are very anxious to learn about this. Somehow, the universe is ready to grow, and people want to know their real nature. And so where I thought there would be no interest, there's a great interest, and I'm delighted to be part of that. So,
well, on that note, so am I.
great.
As a candidate also for New York State Assembly on the
Yes.
Natural Law Party.
I'm so delighted that we're running together. It's very exciting.
It's very exciting. It's a wonderful opportunity to help educate people about that whole concept.
Yes.
I've been really enjoying it.
Basically, what we have to communicate now, as the planet changes and as our culture is maturing is that we as individuals have the ability to intend to experience any reality that we want. And when we take responsibility for that intention, in groups we will literally create heaven on earth. We will create a society that will no longer support crime. We will create a society that no longer has illness. We will create capabilities within the human family that can surpass all the problems of agriculture and ecology. We will literally create every desire and fulfill every desire in a harmonious way that supports every individual and allows everybody to experience delight and joy and bliss without taking away from any individual. And I'm so excited to be alive when that's actually happening in the family of man.
Absolutely. This is so fascinating, and I'm thinking that perhaps we'd like to get together another time, because there are still many things that I believe our viewers would love to learn from you.
Thank you,
So
Sandy.
if you'll join us again, we'd
Sandy,
really appreciate
I would
it.
be thrilled. I'm just bursting to share my experience and the opportunity that your organization has given me, and the pleasure of sitting here sharing it with you has been very, very satisfying. So I would love to come back. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stan, and thank you to all of our viewers for joining us once again for Hours Talks. We'll look forward to seeing you next time.